Hey everyone, welcome to The Conversation. I'm Francesca Fiorentini, your sometimes host. We've got a great show for you today. My first guest is a former gun industry executive, not gun, G-U-N, and currently a senior advisor with Gabby Giffords and author of the book Gunfight. Please welcome Ryan Bausse.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Ryan, so good to have you here. Rarely do we get an insight from someone who actually used to be on the other side lobbying for the gun industry or working with it. Why, can I just ask you, why did you have a change of heart and why did you write your book?
You know, I don't know that I had that much of a change of heart. I think like a lot of people the last many years, right, something changed around me. But in the early 2000s, you know, to the degree I did have a change of heart, I realized then that I was in an industry that was becoming radicalized and would eventually, you know, I feared it would turn the country into what we've had today. And so I stayed in for 15 or 16 years after that, but I did that adhering and fighting for the old responsible sort of firearms ownership that I had grown up with and that I still believe in, not this thing that it has grown into, something that frightens me and should frighten the country, and I think is very dangerous. So, you know, it definitely has changed around me and it has gotten a lot more radical.
And that's, yeah, and that's incredible. And I want to ask you what do you point to in terms of how this country has shifted and has changed and become so radicalized around gun ownership and the type of gun ownership and the, you know, the ways that people own guns, the number of guns that people own, the kinds of guns. What do you attribute that to?
Well, I posit in my book that like the entirety of our national radicalization really started with and centered on this NRA-ism, this all or nothing-ism. The way it came about was in 1999 after Columbine, the NRA decided, you know, they had a choice. Do we want to be a part of the solution? Do we want to double down and use fear and hate to drive membership and fundraising? We know now from unearthed tapes, thanks to NPR, that they literally had those discussions and they chose the latter. They pulled the industry in with them. Then we had a couple of laws that changed. The assault weapons ban was not renewed by Bush, and then PLACA, the Protection of Lawful Commerce and Arms Act, was passed and signed by Bush in 2005. That gave a broad liability shield to gun companies. And then we had the rise of our first black president in 2007, and eventually President Barack Obama won in 2008. And that's where all the kind of NRA radicalization tied in with the industry, needing a symbol and a center of profit, the AR-15, and that's where it took off. And so if you look at our gun sales and radicalization, it was pretty much flat up until about 2007. Since then, it's taken off, and that's the same graph that our national radicalization has followed.
Wow, right. So very much race-based, as a lot of rhetoric was when Barack Obama rose to power and eventually was elected. And being on the inside at that time, what was the discussion? You know, like what was it? Oh yeah, like we're selling these things like hotcakes. I'm not sure, obviously, which specific company you worked for, or if it produced the AR-15. But was there sort of a sense of, yeah, what was that like internally?
So I never produced. I've never owned an AR-15. Never sold them. Never would. You know, I held to my own principles of responsible gun ownership. But you know, to give you an idea, every single person in the industry that I knew, and I knew a lot of them, they referred to Barack Obama as the best gun salesman in America, right? That was his nickname. Nobody called him Barack Obama. They called him the best gun salesman in America because the sort of racist hyperbole, the sort of fear that was built up by the NRA in and around Obama's presidency and the conspiracies that were, you know, let across the country, right? To me, the forerunners to QAnon, it was all this racial undertone, and you know, it was frightening. And at the same time, it was driving sales like no one had ever seen. Before President Obama took office, the country had never purchased more than about 7.5 million guns in a single year ever. By the time he left office, the country was purchasing more than 16.5 million a year.
My God. And yet that still seems like it wasn't enough. I mean, the NRA and gun lobbyists and manufacturers were like, well, this is good. It's sort of like, you know, the golden goose. Let's keep going here.
It's gotten worse.
Yeah, can I just ask you, has there been any sort of similar reckoning to the one you have of like, hey man, like what's going on around us? This is an irresponsible industry. I mean, I would call it that. Or is it just kind of like, let's move forward and hope that your child is not next in a, mass shooting in a school?
Yeah, it's really rationalized like that, and it's gotten a lot worse. And I tell people, you should be frightened about what is to come, the sort of stuff that is marketed now. If you think about the worst, most tumultuous time that any of us have ever lived through, January 1, 2020 to January 7th, 2021, we had COVID, shutdowns, George Floyd, protests, counter protests, troops in the streets, people getting shot. I mean, Trump pouring fuel on all of it. And that corresponds perfectly to the highest gun sales ever in the history of America by a long shot. There were 25 million guns sold in that 12-month period. Damn. And so you have an industry that is both fueling and profiting off of that sort of hatred and fear. And when you have a profit motive to that, like you want more of it, right? And so now you see there's a gun marketed called the Urban Super Sniper. It's an AR-15. I mean, excuse me, but I don't have to use a lot of imagination to know what an urban super sniper is for. And so you see this just ratcheting up the sort of tactical gear that the Buffalo shooter wore. He writes in his manifesto about shopping through all the marketing campaigns. That sort of gear was not even allowed in the industry trade shows 15 years ago, right? Back to the time I started to fight against it and basically saying, don't do this, it's dangerous. And the marketing campaigns now are like a mix of softcore porn and hardcore politics, and I mean conspiracy theory, and like don't go online, it'll ruin you forever, and look at it. But it's no wonder that troubled 18, 19-year-old kids buy these guns and this tactical gear and do these things, right? The marketing's telling them to do it.
Mm-hmm. Usually when you speak to a responsible gun owner or someone who does own guns, and they're always fighting people who want gun safety. They're never fighting against some of the more radical elements of gun ownership and the NRA, as you yourself are doing. So I think that's very fascinating. And I just want to ask, like, what to you, especially now, like what are some concrete steps? And I guess I am curious as to your take on this bipartisan legislation, which is very minor, but I guess considering we haven't done anything on gun safety and control in 30 years, significant, that was recently passed in the Senate. But what do you think about the Senate bill? And then what do you as a responsible gun ownership, what does that look like to you, and what does that mean?
Well, I think the Senate bill, is a series of good first steps. We didn't get into this problem with one big decision or action. We're not going to get out with one simple decision or action. I think that Senate bill starts to kind of reframe the norms of decency and responsibility that the industry knew to adhere to, much like our political system, right? There was a time when sitting members of Congress didn't tweet out pictures or memes of them killing other sitting members of Congress, right? It wasn't that long ago. There were norms we didn't cross. Same thing in the firearms industry. We have to figure out a way to get back there. And I think that laws and regulations like the ones that the Senate just passed and the House just passed today, they go a long ways towards codifying those social norms. We need more of that. We have to start making the world, marginally better instead of making it worse. And I think we have to figure out a way. There's a few other things like, armed intimidation, open carry armed intimidation. This idea that men could march into the Michigan Capitol with loaded AR-15s. That's democracy cannot function that way. We have to figure out a way to outlaw that. That has to go away. I'm worried that it's going to undo democracy if we don't.
Yeah, and you see the Supreme Court, sort of overruling New York State's right to not have open carry, right? And effectively, there's an overreach there. There's no states' rights there when it comes to abortion rights. Tons of states' rights, whatever the hell that means. There's been a theory that the NRA is no longer relevant because the base has been so radicalized around guns that even things like Wayne LaPierre's massive corruption means nothing. And the NRA is kind of just, it's useless. What do you think about that? And then what do you think about how do you change that gun culture? Is it guys like you showing off how they, are safe gun owners and sort of reframing God, country, manliness around that type of archetype?
Well, I think your point about LaPierre and NRA, I think is partially correct. I think the stories of the demise of the NRA are vastly overstated. However, your point about the radicalization is a good one, because what difference does it make now, right? They put the virus in the system, much like Trump and Trumpism. Like Trump is not elected, he's not the president, yet Trumpism still kind of rules our everyday lives. And it's very much the same way. And so the NRA has radicalized that base, and they're not gonna go away, but even if they did go away 100% tomorrow, I don't think the political calculus would change all that much for a long time. So I think you're right about that. How do we change it? I think that, yeah, decent people have to stand up and say, this isn't okay. And so many people, since I've written my book, have reached out to me and, thank you for saying this, thank you for doing this. I know there's millions of them out there, but we have to knock the mic out of people's hands, and we have to understand how we got here, right? This NRAism is so wrapped up into our politics. The reason we can't pass a background check bill that polls at 82%, like nothing polls at 82%, background checks do. We can't pass it. Why? Because NRAism is so wound through the DNA of the Republican Party. Like you're attacking something much larger than just that simple policy thing. And I think that's why everything that we care about, reproductive rights, which is a huge deal, obviously right now, all of this stuff is wound up in that all or nothing politics of the NRA, and we need to understand how we got here.
Is it also about getting gun lobby money out of politics?
I think money is important, but I think the role of money has been vastly overstated too. The real power of these, culture war organizations like the NRA is the fact that they make single issue voters out of several million people, so they can sway key races by 1% or 2%. And in tough elections, they make a difference. Yes, money plays a part in that, but it's what senators and Congress people, what they really fear is that radicalized base. Think of it, same exact thing with Trump. Like, yes, there's money involved, but what the GOP really fears is that radicalized base, them being trolled, them going home to their districts and getting, crazy members or crazy constituents showing up with pickets. Like it's the base that they fear, and that's the same. And that all started with the NRA.
Right, the base that they created, the monster, afraid of their Frankenstein. Ryan Bausse, we've got to leave it there. Such a great. I'm fascinated by this. I hope everyone gets your book. Gunfight is the name of his book. Thank you so much for joining me.
Thank you. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for watching The Young Turks. Really appreciate it. Another way to show support is through YouTube memberships. You'll get to interact with us more. There's live chat emojis, badges. You've got emojis of me, Anna, John, JR. So those are super fun. But you also get playback of our exclusive member-only shows and specials right after they air. So all of that, all you gotta do is click that join button right underneath the video. Thank you.